Was that in?
Good morning. Welcome to the June 25th Eugene Planning Commission. My name is John Borowski. I'm the chair. We have a fairly full agenda today. And I'm going to make, as chair, I'm going to make one adjustment to the agenda. On our agenda, we didn't have our normal public comment listed, but considering the two agenda items that have to do with public involvement plans, I felt it would be appropriate to take public comment. So if there's anybody in the audience that would like to make public comment, there's green forms out there that you can fill out, and we allot 10 minutes at the beginning, so I'm going to say 2 minutes per person. Right now I have one person signed up. I have John Belcher signed up. If there's anybody else that would like to speak, just go ahead and fill out a form or raise your hand. You can fill out the form afterwards. So with that, John, if you'd like to step up to the table and address us.
Not used to being down here.
Yeah.
Well, you can sit closer to us.
Well,
It's been a while since you've been down here.
that's true.
Yeah.
So, to the Planning Commission. When planning staff set out to develop the project charter and project initiation plan for the River Road Santa Cruz neighborhood plan, they worked with our neighborhood board to develop these documents. That degree of involvement is one of the reasons that planning process is working so well. Compare that to the development of the charter and PIP for the clear and objective housing criteria update. To my knowledge, none of the stakeholder groups were consulted as these two documents were developed. As a result, the first and only time the neighborhood board stakeholder focus group met, there was no effort to solicit feedback about the process, but instead we dove into questions of our issues with the current land use approval process, our concerns with specific decision criteria, and how we felt about how discretionary and clear objective standards were currently working. Unfortunately, many of us in the room lack sufficient knowledge and experience to respond, as none of us have been involved in all those land use procedures being considered, and we definitely lack sufficient background on both the discretionary and the needed housing process. This is less likely to be the case for land use attorneys and development professionals, but I suspect the Sustainability Commission, tree preservation and natural resource advocates, transportation advocates, and others likely find themselves with that same knowledge gap. For this project, it's critical that staff develop an understanding in the key stakeholders of how the processes currently work, the criteria they use for decision making, the issues they deal with, and differences between them. Without that knowledge, the feedback you will receive will be as unusable as, I think, project boundaries should be planted with pink and yellow flowers. Staff needs to create a document that outlines both the current discretionary and needed housing paths, their procedural differences, and the development standards they affect. Reasonable, knowledgeable people will disagree on these details, so I believe there also needs to be a feedback step for more knowledgeable stakeholders to give feedback on the accuracy, completeness, and lack of bias of the product, or the process will bog down in argument over basic data. It's unlikely that will be 100% consensus, so I suggest staff include minority statements in that document. Additionally, City Council's indicated they want this effort to expedite the development application process. That's a laudable goal, but it requires that 15 group of stakeholders with disparate and sometimes conflicting interests agree on a series of simpler, more formulaic procedures that start from value set in Envision Eugene that can be developed into unambiguous assessment mechanisms the majority can support. That's an ambitious task requiring lots of understanding and compromise. It won't be easy, it won't be quick, but it has to be right. Otherwise, there's the potential that this streamlined local development process will just lead to more appeals to loop in the Court of Appeals, which will make the process even more expensive for all parties and longer to complete, essentially making things worse rather than better. So, finally, let me return how this process got off to a rocky start. The staff didn't seek feedback and support from the primary stakeholders when developing the project's charter and PIP. I request that you, as a Citizen Involvement Committee for Land Use Processes in Eugene, require that any future documents of this nature include this crucial step of involving stakeholders, or you shouldn't approve them. I know from 13 years personal experience how much time, knowledge, and wisdom it takes to do your job, and I thank you for your service.
Thank you. All right. Seeing no other things, people, we will move on to our next action item, which is approval of the Urban Reserves Planning public involvement process.
I can't talk and type at the same time.
That's all right.
Really? One sec, sorry about that. Hello.
Hi there.
Hi.
Sorry about that. Thank you for having me. Good afternoon, members of the public, commissioners. My name's Rebecca Gershow. I'm a senior planner with City of Eugene, who is hired to talk to you and to work on, more importantly, the Urban Reserves Project. And today, we are specifically going to talk about the public involvement plan and provide a little bit of additional background information. So we were last here on May 8th when we presented background information on urban reserves planning. including the project charter and the public involvement plan. You had some questions and process suggestions, and one suggested addition to the stakeholder list, which we have incorporated. Since then, we met with the Lane County Planning Commission twice, the Eugene City Council, and the Lane County Board of Commissioners. We met with the County Planning Commission twice because our time was limited at our first meeting, and they had a number of questions that we couldn't get to, so we offered to come back to talk to them again. We also prepared a memo responding to one of the commissioners' list of questions that he had that he emailed after the meeting, and that memo was emailed to you back on June 6th, just so that we would all have the same information. So as summarized in your AIS, agency input that we've received so far on the public involvement plan was mostly general in nature, really on the urban reserves planning, and not really related to the public involvement plan specifically. We received questions about project-wise about urban reserves, whether we could implement urban reserves at the same time as whether we can implement urban reserves. Questions about how urban reserves would be regulated or could be regulated in the future, and the urgency, really less a question and more a directive, the urgency of moving quickly due to our community's housing crisis. So just in the spirit of making sure we're all on the same page, I wanted to share a few additional slides that we created after we came to the Planning Commission that we shared with the other bodies. You, I believe, did not have the same level of questions because you are more immersed in this than some of the other folks, but I wanted to present probably 5 minutes of background information just so you have that same information. So we talked about how urban reserves are important today for a number of reasons. As you know, housing supply and affordability is already a critically important issue in our community. And preparing an urban reserves proposal for both the city and county consideration by January 2020 is aligned with the work of our growth monitoring program and Council's direction to re-examine our UGB the following year in January 2021. So this will allow the city to consider a UGB expansion onto urban reserve land if there is a need to expand at that time. We feel that this point is important to note because without urban reserves, future UGB expansions for housing would likely be limited by state law to these exception areas and non-resource lands, which on this map from our UGB expansion analysis are shown in rust around the perimeter of our UGB. These lands include the airport, LCC, and rural residential lands scattered around the city. The problem is many of these areas are already developed to some degree and have a very low likelihood of redevelopment if they're brought into the UGB. You may remember from our UGB process that our studies showed most of these lands are extremely expensive to serve and may not meet our community's needs. This is a key point that we've been talking about with folks because if we don't have if we don't have our urban reserves in place when there is a need to expand our UGB, then our choices will be limited to these exception areas and non-resource lands. Urban reserves gives us additional options for smart growth and for meeting the goals of Envision Eugene if and when there is a need to expand. So
Could you go back what the color code means, just in case? You did the one color, but what about the green?
So the green is priority, what was at the last analysis, priority 3, marginal lands. Priority 1 at that time was urban reserves, but we didn't have urban reserves. Mm-hmm. Now, which I'll get into in a minute, priority 1 is urban reserves and also exception areas and non-resource lands, these rust areas. Excuse me. I'm coming off of a cold, so I apologize. Priority 3 is the green that you can see is marginal lands, and then the light green and the light brown are ag and forest lands in descending order of high value. So we created this very simplified diagram to sort of talk about the process in a more general way, as another way of looking at it, where we created this dark blue city, this rectangular city, with its UGB surrounding it that's supplying enough land for 20 years of growth. And let's say this city grows and its leaders determine the UGB needs to be expanded as one way to meet the needs of its growing population. So without urban reserves, this is how cities usually do it. The state has set up this ranking system for analyzing land suitable for urbanization. Urban reserves, like I was just saying, exception areas and non-resource lands are all first priority. Those are shown as these dashed little rectangles around the UGB. However, without urban reserves in place, cities are limited to these other first priority lands. We already discussed how many of the potential problems with them, excuse me. So these exception areas and non-resource lands are often inefficient and expensive to serve and develop. They often have limited access to transit and other services. They're scattered around the edges of the community and non-contiguous, and they have low future development potential because many are already fully or partially developed. So with urban reserves, cities can go this route, which sets aside enough land for 10 to 30 years of growth beyond the UGB. Because the time frame is so much greater than with the UGB expansion, more land is needed, so cities may consider including lower priority lands as part of their urban reserves. With a larger contiguous area of land making up urban reserves, there are more opportunities for cost savings and efficiencies when planning for transit, roads, and other services, such as water, wastewater, fire protection, parks, and schools to serve our future neighborhoods. So then, once urban reserves are designated, they automatically become first priority land when it's time for cities to analyze where to expand their urban growth boundary. The final step is bringing these urban reserves into the UGB when the time is right. Urban reserve land is further analyzed and planned based on cities' expansion needs, then brought into the UGB for specific uses, such as housing or jobs. Now, I know this is sort of planning 101 for you guys. You've been thinking about this for years longer than I have, but I wanted to make sure that we were all on the same page with this information.
Yeah.
Just a question. When you're planning for the urban reserves, what I thought I heard you might say is that when the time comes to be used, they're then needed to see and analyze how much is needed. Does that mean that you can designate more urban reserves in a greater amount than what may be needed?
Could you, I'm not sure I got the question.
Let's say I don't know how you're going to do it, but like they did it on the UGB. They say that past the 20 years, we might have another growth of 30,000. To accommodate 30,000, we need X.
Mm-hmm.
X would mean so much land. What I'm saying, can you do urban reserves greater than what that anticipated X is?
So we can do urban reserves for 10 years beyond the urban growth boundary. What we think that land need is to 30 years beyond the UGB, so up to 50 years out. And then we need to make a policy decision as part of the urban reserves designation of how much land we feel comfortable banking as urban reserves Then, so let's say we say 30 years beyond the UGB, we want to set aside in reserve land that would meet our needs, we believe, 30 years beyond the urban growth boundary. Then when we do our UGB analysis, it's incremental in nature, as it always has been, but you can choose more strategically what areas inside the urban reserves you would like to grow into. You don't need to grow into the entire urban reserves at once. Is that your question?
And then they can be readjusted if after 40 years from now, the growth is more than anticipated, and you'll say, we've got to start doing more urban reserves.
You could do another UGB expansion, or you could choose to go through the urban reserves
Okay, thank you.
process again. Yeah. So focusing on the public involvement plan, which we're asking, excuse me, for you to approve today. It includes project goals, a summarized project work plan focusing on the public engagement strategies at each milestone, and a lengthy list of stakeholders that will be updated as we proceed. In addition, the public involvement plan details how individuals and organizations with a stake in the outcome of urban reserves can effectively participate and help shape the plan. It's equitable, thorough, and in keeping with Eugene's public participation guidelines, and it far exceeds State Goal 1 and legal requirements. So this is our outreach process graphic, which is a key piece of our public involvement plan. To refresh your memory on this, the project's major phases are shown in the middle, with project committees, planning commission, council, and board of commissioners meetings shown along the bottom, and public engagement opportunities along the top. It shows a variety of different ways for the public to weigh in, including large open houses, smaller area-specific meetings, and interactive online engagement for those who aren't interested or able to participate in person. It also includes the ways we'll engage our community groups, service providers, public agencies, and boards and commissions at key decision points throughout the process. So we are currently wrapping up phase 1, project initiation, beginning with the technical analysis, and through our option development phase, we will be updating our land supply projections, developing a study area, analyzing land suitable for inclusion in an urban reserve, and determining the preferred planning period, location, and size of an urban reserve. It's a technical, multi-step approach which will include significant public engagement. Our deadlines are we will be bringing a proposal to Council and Board of Commissioners by January of 2020, which we've shown here in red in the proposed urban reserve phase. To begin the formal adoption process, if directed by Council and the Board of Commissioners at that point. Then, if directed, staff will prepare a complete adoption package and schedule the first formal public hearing by fall of 2020, which is the final phase that we're showing here. So today, we also want to talk about the Envision Eugene Technical Advisory Committee. We're asking the Planning Commission to recommend one commissioner to the ETAC, included in our recently adopted comprehensive plan. The ETAC will advise staff on citywide growth management initiatives, focusing first on urban reserve planning, and then throughout its tenure, the growth monitoring program. The ETAC will review project assumptions and technical analysis. ETAC members will represent varied voices from across the community with diverse interests and areas of expertise. Members are going to be appointed by the city manager, and recruitment is currently underway. We've received 5 applications so far. The next steps after today, I talked about our ETAC recruitment and appointment. We're moving into our technical analysis, which is phase 2. We're working on our land demand analysis and setting our preliminary study area. We're planning on holding our first meeting with our ETAC in September to talk about those technical analysis work we're working on over the summer. And our first major public meeting will be held in early October. So today, we're asking the Planning Commission to approve the public involvement plan with the one addition of adding University of Oregon as a stakeholder, and to consider recommendation of one commissioner to serve on the ETAC. And I'll open it up for questions.
All right, so let's do the public involvement plan section first, and then we'll move on to the ETAC.
I just had one more question before, because on the EIS on page 3, you talked about urban reserves, and you said how the urban reserves area will be managed and regulated. Could you expound on that a little bit? I mean, I know if you pick all these urban reserves, you want to stop certain growth from going there because you want to use it for the expansion that you feel is so designated. So is this urban reserves going to be rezoned? How would one do that?
So the County Planning Commission asked what regulatory framework we were going to be using for managing urban reserves. And that is something that we will determine as the project continues. So it's one of the key decision points that we're going to have to make. The OAR lists types of regulatory framework that you could put on the urban reserves, but leaves it to the city and county to determine. They basically are saying that urban reserves shall remain rural until they are urbanized and brought into the urban growth boundary. However, you can continue using your land how you have been using your land. So it's very generalized, but that is something that I expect both planning commissions are going to be working on as part of this project.
Yes.
I just have a question regarding the public involvement plan on urban reserves. I know we've received quite a bit of communication regarding
They're an
the objective standards. Have we received either similar amount, which I would guess we would have seen, or
Right.
any regarding the public improvement?
We have really not received any beyond the input that we've gotten at the meetings we have attended.
Okay.
Okay. Yeah, as far as input, I attended the city council work session that was presented at, and most of the questions went past the public involvement plan and kind of got more into the meat and potatoes of the issue. So I'm comfortable with moving forward with this.
I felt it was a rhetorical question.
Yeah, a public involvement plan. I did have a question, though, as far as input on early guidelines, or I don't know if that's what it is, but one of the things that when we were doing the UGB expansion, there were assumptions that were made that we came to later on that were made early on in the process. And the one that I'm thinking of is that for the industrial lands expansion, there was a requirement that it be within 1 mile of it was a corridor or a major transit requirement. So that meant either Highway 99 or I-5, which severely limited it. At what point are those types of assumptions or guidelines going to be built into this plan? Because that one was built in very early. And then we were like, well, how come you can't look at this? Well, because it's 1.5 miles from Highway 99. So can you tell me?
We're already having those conversations about what level of analysis we need to undertake for urban reserves, because it's much more generalized, the requirements, than for the urban growth boundary. And the urban growth boundary requirements have changed since we last did them. So I will say early on in the technical analysis phase, we will be determining what level of detailed standards and assumptions we'll need to make similar to those. We're already working on the assumptions that we need to be making for the land demand analysis piece, because there's a series of assumptions there too. So it's as we proceed, we are going to be working on those.
So then I guess that goes to my public involvement part. So would that be something that the ETAC would be looking at and being able to give input on, or is that just staff driven? Where is the public input on those types of things? Yeah.
Yeah, so we imagine that the work that we're doing over the summer, we're going to be bringing to the ETAC in early September for them to review and provide input on, and then we will be providing that to the public at our first public meeting in October, and sort of working along the way in that manner.
Mr. Taylor?
Good question. So I'm looking at the schedule. So do both council and commissioners, do they get that update to understand what parameters are established?
So we aren't planning on coming back for a work session to the Planning Commission until about a year from now, when we're wrapping up our technical analysis, but we were assuming we would be sending email updates to the Planning Commission like we did with the Lane County Planning Commission information that we disseminated when there are key points that we thought made sense to check in. If there are other points, if your ETAC representative, flags different issues that they would like brought back to the Planning Commission before then.
So it's an option, because it sounds like, because some of the parameters are fairly generalized, that getting that upfront, I know we've talked about this in the past, is getting that upfront kind of accountability from the decision makers early on as a benchmark before we're actually sitting in front of the various groups for an approval process, so that if there are those preliminary discussions or concerns, they can be addressed when they
I think that's a really key piece of why we want a planning commissioner on our ETAC, so they can act as that liaison back to the body. And then if there are things that are flagged as worthy of discussion with the entire planning commission, we're happy
or
to.
up. I'm thinking city commissioners and council.
Or up.
just so-
And we will
yeah.
have a city council liaison as well, so similar process.
Great.
There. But that is a good reminder. That's one of the reasons why we did flag some of our key assumptions with the Planning Commission and with the other bodies when we were talking this first round, key assumptions of not changing the density mix, not using the 2015 population projections as we're moving forward. Some of those key assumptions that we feel that are important to let everyone know and to be able to move forward with, so that we can move forward in a timely and efficient manner. So the assumptions that we knew already that we were moving forward with, we've already been sharing with folks, but we're happy to talk more about it.
Thank you.
Mr. Jaworski?
Yeah, I'll just do a little now and come back. I'm walking through by the pages. The general questions are good. On page 10 of the AIS, you talk about the triple bottom line sounding board, and you show, I guess, the composition of those members. And besides different things they need to do for broader community perspectives and how to best reach community members, et cetera, I look at that and I just see pretty much, for lack of a better term,
Thank you.
thank goodness you had that sheet there.
Yeah, Robin's got it.
It's thank you.
I'm just going to take this one.
It was either that or threatening to cough all over you, so,
Right, you made a good choice.
which I may do anyway. So the TVL sounding board,
I can wait a minute.
okay.
All right, we got it.
Funny, I was
This
just
is a
thinking.
nice save on the keyboard.
Yeah, she's lucky she had that there.
Good instincts.
There's some more in case.
Thank you. Thank you. Hello.
On the triple bottom line, I was saying that, not to be redundant, but they represent the broader community's perspective, and further on it says they'll know how to best reach out to community members, et cetera, et cetera. When I look at that, I see a lot of governmental entities for the most part, to be honest with you. And I see maybe the chamber, okay, but that's specific members. Why aren't there any neighborhood associations or something, or the NLC there that really works with neighborhoods and can reach out? I'm a little confused for getting a broader perspective, why they're not included.
So this framework was designed not just for this project, but for involving multiple projects across the city with this triple bottom line framework. So it's certainly not the only way that we are getting input from groups. But the idea is that, excuse me, that we had representatives who were representing environmental equity and economic impacts throughout the city. So the focus was on those cities, boards, and commissions, but we realized that we didn't really have an economic perspective on a city board or commission focused specifically, so we added the chamber to here. I understand what you're saying about including the neighborhoods, and we're planning on including other stakeholder groups in other ways throughout the project. The triple bottom line sounding board we have coming in 3 different times so that we can present the information that we've heard from the broader public already, and that we can get their take on it, and they can report back to their boards and commissions on the work that we're doing. But that it isn't meant to represent everyone across, every group across the community. That was the thinking behind it.
Well, I'm just saying, I hope your thinking hasn't stopped there, and there may be inclusion later, but that's, I don't know who appointed this or made this board. I have an issue with it because I don't see this group as presented as being ones that go out and reach the community. Being a commissioner, I just represent the broad community. It'd be hard for me to reach out, or any other commissioners, to the total universe. But gets back to what you said in the second part, which is my second question, as for now, is that you said there will be other public input. At the bottom of that same page, it says Urban Reserve Study residents will be mailed information, blah, 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 on the project. And then on the next page is community meeting number 1. At this first meeting, is that the project study area, only within the study area, or is that the city as a whole?
Sorry, I'm trying to find where you are. At our first meeting,
Yeah.
study area residents, we will be sending notice to all of our study area residents, but we will be advertising that meeting broadly. So that meeting will be open to a broad array of folks, but we will specifically be noticing the folks who are potentially directly impacted by urban reserves.
Okay, well, urban reserves to me is a way of leading into what was the urban growth boundary expansion, which involved the whole city. Methods used before to contact everybody in the whole city has never been all that successful. So I think that there should be a stronger effort than what I see presented so far to reach out to the broader community than just by saying, we're meeting somewhere in the Southwest Hills expansion potential urban reserve area, do you want to come? That's not, in other words, if you'd only work in one certain area, this part of the city may never want to get involved, but yet they are interested in whether or not there's an urban growth boundary expansion. That's what I have for now.
Okay. Mr. Taylor.
So I'll start with the last point Commissioner Jaworski made, because I just have a question. So addressing his concern, is that community meeting that's established at the beginning of this summer, is that the effort to reach out to the broader community to start to inform them about the process?
So we've already done
You already have.
We've already done online communication and been sending out information in newsletters and via electronic resources, but that is our first kickoff public meeting.
Okay. And going back to his question, is that really, so then after that, that will be the only meeting held for the larger community, and then you'll outreach in various ways. And then it starts to get to area meetings. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay. Okay. So here's.
And it's sort of, sorry,
Yeah, no, it's all right.
you know, it's a bit iterative. What we are how we're thinking about this. At this point, we're thinking that when we are mid-technical analysis, it's really going to be, people are going to be interested in looking at specific focus areas. So we were thinking it would be more useful to go out to different areas and
Yeah.
talk to people about those areas. If we feel that there are broad topics that make sense, it could be organized as one bigger meeting, but oftentimes it's much easier to have a face-to-face communication if you're being able to focus in on specific areas.
So I had a similar observation, and this might actually address both of Commissioner Jaworski's concerns. I also had the same observation about neighborhood leaders. I love that have a triple bottom line sounding board, and that's a part of the public process and about our projects. I think in terms of the equity portion of triple bottom line, and the fact that, yes, while it's great to get those area meetings to have a community-wide understanding, if there's an NLC delegate, so if they vote for a person to attend that meeting, it addresses a few things. One, you address the equity piece so that they're a stakeholder, a part of that process, and it directly addresses equity. You also have a delegate or the liaison, like you're talking about, that can actually go to the various neighborhood associations and kind of satisfy, to some degree, making sure that the community understands the process. So I had a similar, and yeah, that's it.
Okay. Well, we have about 5 more minutes on this item, and then we still have to do the E-tax. So if there's one more thing on the public involvement plan?
Yes, I thought we had more time than that.
We've got 3 more
Let me-
items to get through today.
All right, on page 11, when you talk about urban reserve action options, I guess 2 things I had here is one, you already have some potential areas up there. Are you determining the areas first, or are you determining the need, or is the need driving the areas? And my question, which gets back to public involvement, when does the entire city have an opportunity to input on determining the need? Because that was the big issue when we expanded the urban growth boundary. That's the first question.
So we are setting a preliminary study area, which is the broad area that we will be studying. Then we will be analyzing the land. We will be doing a sort of gross needs analysis. This is the number of acres that we're going to need. Then we will be doing the analysis within that study area. Then we will be looking at the need based on the actual on-the-ground land, where we could expand to, and the extent to which folks would like to set urban reserves. So the develop urban reserves options is getting more into specific urban reserves areas, but we will be doing the broad technical analysis before then.
I hear the we, but I
Okay.
want to know, where's the public in determining the need? Like if you're coming up and saying, well, we're going to have to plan for 25,000 new houses or apartments or whatever. How did you
Right.
come up with that, and was there public input on that?
Right, so we will just to be pointing to the diagram here. So we will be meeting with our ETAC in this technical analysis period throughout the process, as well as our service provider working group. We'll also be having 2 sets of community meetings during that technical analysis phase.
Broad-based?
Pardon?
Broad-based or just in the areas?
We were planning on having 1 broad-based and 1 broken down by area. Those will still be advertised broadly, so anyone can attend those meetings. We'll be having meetings with individual stakeholder groups a couple of different times in the beginning and as we start developing our technical analysis. We'll also be involving people online, so doing online interactive mapping we've been talking about, so people can go into different areas in the urban reserve area and let us know what they think about different areas, or we can also we've also talked about doing more generalized surveying. So we'll be checking in with the TBL sounding board twice during that time. Like I said, after we get our broader public input, we'll be checking in with the ETAC first on our assumptions. We'll be getting our broader public involvement, and then we will be sharing that information with leaders and decision makers throughout the city through the TBL sounding board.
And
so
they're all
it's
open to the public, those sounding board meetings and all of them, and people can comment
They
like
will
they do
all be
here?
public meetings.
And you can, okay.
And we will be sharing all of that information on our project website and communicating the information that we will be developing throughout via our website, but also through other e-notifications, newsletters, that type of thing. And if there are other specific means that you think are important for us to include in terms of communications that we don't do on a regular basis, that would be important for us to hear about.
Okay, finally, real quick, formal adoption process and IGA development. All that you have listed under there, the bullets, are they occurring before or are they after? Because I got confused when I read community meeting to communicate to the city, to the council and county direction. I'm confused there. If there's already direction, that's not allowing for input, that's just telling you what's happening. So I get a little confused.
Sure, I'm not sure exactly where you were looking at, but let me.
Page 12, third bullet.
Community meeting, communicate council and county direction and answer questions as needed. So that's during the last phase, that's during our formal adoption process. So, right, there were questions from the county about how we were doing that, and in the project charter, I believe we need a little bit more clarification on the phases of IGA development. So we need to wait until we have an agreed upon urban reserve proposed area in order to finalize our IGAs, because they're specific for the service providers in those urban reserve areas. So that's the final
I understand.
IGA development.
I'm trying to ask, if they come out with this proposal, can it be modified, or otherwise, what are these meetings for, if not to give public input to say, we have some real concerns with your proposal?
So
This is saying, well, it doesn't matter to me.
So there will be meetings, there will be the meetings that are shown on there before our proposed urban reserves, which will be input meetings. The meetings after you, as the planning commission, make a recommendation to the city council makes a motion to move forward on a proposed urban reserve area. We will then be communicating that direction that we've received with the public, but we will be less asking for input at that point and more communicating the direction that we have received. However, with the IGAs, with developing the details of the IGAs, we're going to start on that work early on. We just can't put those final pieces in place until we have direction on where we're moving forward on.
That said, I'd just like to clarify that at any point during the formal adoption process, we're absolutely asking for public input. It's just very clear at that point what we're asking for input on, because the City Council and the Lane County Planning Board of Commissioners will have said, yeah, this is the set of urban reserves we think we want. Go out and ask people, and we'll be asking for the range of impacts and whatever it is that we hear that will then be brought back, if that makes sense. But not to say that we're not, there's plenty of opportunities for input in that phase as well.
Okay. At this point, are we ready to adopt or give a thumbs up on the public involvement plan?
So moved, including the University of Oregon as a stakeholder.
Okay, second? Second?
I'll second it with a friendly amendment.
Sure.
I'll second, I do think it would be smart to add an NLC member delegate to the Triple Bottom Line Committee.
Okay. Any other discussion? All those in favor? 4-0. In regards to the ETAC recommendation of planning commissioner, we do have time to wait on that until the deadline for applications is the 15th, and then they're going to be doing interviews and those types of things. So I feel it would be prudent to wait till our new commissioners are seated and then have this discussion. So we have a couple of meetings before then. We have deliberation meetings, and again, I think this is a short process, kind of like what committees are open and this and that, and kind of getting them available. So we could, depending on how deliberations go on the appeal that we have coming up, there may be time at the end of that, 5 or 10 minutes to discuss it then. If not, we do have a meeting on July 10th that we could put that in. So if everybody's okay with that.
I was actually going to suggest that myself.
Okay. All right, so then we'll do that, and
I also want to add that I am willing to be on this committee, so we can wait, but just so.
Well, and I'm very interested in it as well. I was on the TRG, the last half of the TRG, so this is one that
Expire before it all gets done, so I'm not.
So, yeah, we'll,
I don't think it'd be prudent. So.
right. So we'll have that discussion at that point. Okay, our next item on the agenda is we've got legal requirements for clear and objective housing, and then we're going to move into the public involvement plan for clear and objectives.
Thanks, Rebecca.
Thank you. Sorry about the
Thank you.
wetness.
No worries. It'll be the first time we've had cold water thrown on.
Thank you, planning commissioners, for having me back again. For members of the public who might be watching, my name is Lauren Summers. I'm an assistant city attorney for the city of Eugene. And I'm here today to talk to you a little bit about needed housing and clear and objective standards. And this work session was scheduled for you today for a couple of reasons. There have been some recent changes to the needed housing statutes via Senate Bill 1051, which we've talked a lot about in the context of ADUs, but not as much in the context of needed housing. That was a separate piece of that bill. In addition, as you well know, we are in the process of a clear and objective code update, and so it seemed like a good time to review and kind of give context for that. I have provided you with copies of the two kind of main needed housing statutes, ORS 197.303 and 197.307. You shouldn't need them for this presentation, but that way you have them if you ever want to refer to them later. And so I will turn to our first slide. The terms needed housing and clear and objective standards have been used pretty interchangeably historically. And that used to make more sense because needed housing was entitled to clear and objective standards. However, now, post Senate Bill 1051, Senate Bill 1051 made it clear that all housing, whether it is needed housing or not, is entitled to clear and objective standards. So those terms are not quite as interchangeable as they once were. And I wanted to kind of run you through the specific meanings of each of those terms. So starting with needed housing. Needed housing is defined as all housing types that are located on land that is either zoned for residential use or for mixed residential and commercial use. And it's also housing that is determined to meet the need shown for housing within the city's urban growth boundary at price ranges and rent levels that are affordable to households with a variety of incomes. So for our purposes, needed housing is housing that's identified in the city's adapted housing needs analysis. It's part of the analysis that goes into setting our urban growth boundary and urban growth boundary expansion. The statute calls out several types of housing that is included within the umbrella of needed housing, single-family, multifamily, government-assisted, mobile homes, and manufactured dwelling parks, and housing for farm workers. It's not an exhaustive list, but all of those types of housing are included as needed housing. Needed housing does not include housing that's on land that is zoned other than residential or mixed residential and commercial use. And so in Eugene, I think we don't have much of that, but we do have a little. There's some housing that's allowed on ag zone land, I believe, and public land zone land, very little, some caretaker housing in commercial zones. Is that accurate, Alyssa?
Yeah, or industrial,
Or if there were housing that is not required to meet the need showed for housing within the UGB. So in Eugene, I don't think we have a category of that housing, but in other cities, they may have a large excess supply of a certain type of housing that wouldn't be considered needed. I have seen some communications that seem to assume that needed housing is synonymous with low-income housing or affordable housing. That's not the case. In terms of the land use statutory definition, needed housing is all housing at all price ranges and rent levels, so very expensive housing can be needed housing under the land use code. Doesn't want to go. Oh, too far. Okay. So we talked about this a little bit already, but prior to the passage of Senate Bill 1051, only needed housing was entitled to clear and objective standards, and I'll get into that, what that means in more detail in just a moment. But post Senate Bill 1051, the legislature has clarified that all housing, needed or not, is entitled to clear and objective standards. It gets a little bit confusing because at the time Eugene adopted its clear and objective standards, only needed housing was entitled to them. So we have a needed housing track in our code, and then we have a general discretionary track for 5 types of land use applications. So we refer to our clear and objective standards as our needed housing track, but these days, all housing is entitled to clear and objective standards. And so I'm not sure if this will be a recommendation as part of the clear and objective update, but I would advocate for calling that track something other than the needed housing track, maybe the clear and objective track or something. Let's see.
Do you want me to wait till the end now?
No, I can take questions whenever.
So how would it work now that it's even housing that doesn't meet the definition of needed housing? How does it work if it's a mixed use? Is there some kind of threshold? So essentially, if it's predominantly commercial, but there's 2 units, can you still go through a clear and objective process? Like, is there some kind of parameter boundary?
At this point, if my understanding is if there is housing included in a project, that housing is entitled to clear and objective standards.
So if you had an application process, could the whole thing go under clear and objective, even though there was only one house? Are you splitting? I mean, because that's
a good question.
That would be challenging.
Yeah, and that is a policy call more than a legal question. The legal basis is housing, clear and objective.
Got it.
If it's a mixed application, figuring out how to deal with that could be challenging.
Yeah, really challenging. Okay.
I understand when you said that whether you go a discretionary route or needed housing, they have to be clear and objective. Traditionally, when neighborhoods looked at developments and they went needed housing, they were somewhat precluded from what they could input and say as far as neighborhood character, impacts on the neighborhood, whatever. When you start to make these more clear and objective, will you address that issue, or will that issue still be the same as someone takes the needed housing track versus the discretionary route, even though it's clear and objective in the discretionary route?
That's a good question, Commissioner Jaworski. Again, that's a bit of a policy call, and figuring out how to craft code language that complies with the legal requirements and allows housing applications in particular to be more efficiently processed and takes into account neighborhood concerns. I mean, that's difficult, and I think that is what this clear and objective update process is for.
So, okay, well, that's the whole issue. I mean, otherwise, why have two tracks? If they're both clear and objective, that's the big difference to me.
Well, so just to clarify, at this point, the way our code is constructed is we have the needed housing track, which is completely filled with clear and objective standards.
I understand.
Then we have the discretionary track, which may include some clear and objective standards, but also includes some very discretionary standards.
Okay.
And so they're not the same. A housing applicant is always entitled to clear and objective standards, so they may always choose the needed housing track. But they also have the ability to choose the discretionary track, and they may do that for a number of reasons, including that some of those discretionary standards offer more flexibility than the clear and objective standards. Because in order to draft a standard that is clear and objective, often we need to make it very straightforward, very specific, and it doesn't offer a developer a lot of flexibility in the way that they design their proposal, whereas some of the discretionary standards do offer more flexibility.
Okay. Just for the record, since it's my last meeting, I just want to go on and say I disagree with the interpretation of the Senate bill on what all types of housing are. I think the city can choose to say all housing is needed housing, but I feel that the city can also choose to say, based on what we've seen presented to us on the urban growth boundary of what gaps were in housing, both in apartments and in rental units, that they could set those standards so that those two are addressed and they're the only needed housing. The rest can go a clear and objective discretionary route. I don't know why they're not doing it. I feel they should. That's just a comment.
Okay. I'll turn to my second to final slide, and we've talked about a little bit of this just in kind of our colloquy. Bottom line with clear and objective standards is the housing applicant is always entitled to them. So we must provide housing applicants with a clear and objective path. We are also able, as a city, to provide housing applicants with a separate discretionary path, but they get to make the decision about which path they would like to follow. When we say clear and objective standards, just to, again, clarify terms a little bit, that's a shorthand more than just what we call standards in our code must be clear and objective. So approval criteria, conditions of approval, development standards, application review procedures, all need to be clear and objective. A city's clear and objective standards may not either individually or cumulatively discourage the development of needed housing due to unreasonable cost and delay. So we have kind of a double analysis when it comes to housing. Our standards have to be clear and objective, and we have to worry about unreasonable cost and delay. And sort of my interpretation of the legislature's intent behind these clear and objective requirements is that a housing applicant in particular should be able to look at the city's clear and objective standards, right now our needed housing track, and be able to know exactly what they need to do to get an approval. So it is clear in the code that, if I check all these boxes, my application should be approved. A discretionary track may not be quite as clear because the approval criteria tend to be more subjective, but they also tend to be more flexible. So it may give an applicant more ability to design a development in the way that they would like. And then there's a couple narrow exceptions from the requirement for clear and objective standards, one of which only applies to Portland, and then one that does apply to us, but only in our historic areas.
Commissioner Taylor?
Lauren, so I'm going to go back just because I'm going to mention it. Because of the time and delay component of clear and objective, my question about how do you deal with mixed use, just keep top of mind that I know you said it's policy, there is a direct link to time and delay.
Sure.
If there's a couple residential units and they're at the top of the development, if it's a multi-story and there's commercial below. Obviously, if one is discretionary and the top is clear and objective, you have a time and delay. So just as we're considering this, there are some very integrated things to consider when you've got a mixed-use development. Because then we would end up in an appeal, in a battle of really clear and objective being compromised. Potentially. Yeah.
It's a tricky balance.
And
And I will say that cities throughout the state struggle with it.
Yeah.
And Eugene, maybe more than most, because Eugene tried to implement these clear and objective requirements very early on. There are cities in the state who have sort of been hoping that no one will notice that their standards are clear and objective. But, Eugene really kind of got out in front of it, tried to draft its code in a way that we thought complied with the statutes, and now is taking the initiative to look again and say, do our clear and objective standards, we think that they are clear and objective, but are they presenting unnecessary hurdles to development? Are there other things that we should be looking at when we're looking at these clear and objective standards? So right now, we talked about the needed housing track and the general discretionary track. Our code is set up so those two tracks apply to the 5 following application types: conditional use permits, partitions, plan unit development, site review, and subdivision. And then separately, building permits also are subject to clear and objective standards, but for slightly different reasons. So that is our current code setup. There's no particular legal requirement for it to be set up this way, but it was the way that at the time it was adopted, we thought would work. And then this is the last piece that we've been talking about. Housing applicants are entitled to clear and objective standards, but may choose a different approval track that involves discretionary standards. And in our code, each application type that has a needed housing track also offers a general discretionary track. And and then finally, that's kind of, to summarize, needed housing track, our clear and objective standards are intended to offer clarity and certainty to an applicant. The general track tends to offer more flexibility. So those are the very high-level trade-offs between the two options.
Mr. Taylor.
This is kind of a question statement, rhetorical, is because this is obviously the feedback and important, the public is very interested. Just the discretionary track, talk about this a little bit more, because it doesn't mean in a discretionary tract of any of those applications that you're not meeting the code. The code is still applicable. So each of the relevant code standards is applicable to a development. The approval criteria for approval of those various applications might be a little bit more discretionary, for instance, compatibility. But you're not arbitrarily, flexibly kind of designing a project. You have to comply with the various code standards that are applicable to the development. So there's a fine nuance that I don't want the public to think that a discretionary application means that you get to pick and choose what you apply for and you have complete flexibility, except PUDs have an element of flexibility built into its purpose statement, but you still have to meet the intent of the code. So I just wanted to.
Thank you for those comments, Commissioner. I agree. You are right. And to the extent that I implied otherwise,
No,
I
it's
appreciate the
just,
clarification.
I understood. I just wanted to make sure, yeah.
Mr. Randall.
Well, and I think to kind of put it in maybe a little different way, at least what helps me, is it's kind of like prescriptive standards and performance standards. I think the building code is that way. So, for instance, on the energy code, you have prescriptive standards that say if you do this, 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 and this, then you meet it outright. And so the way I see this is the one standard says if you meet A, B, C, and D, you have approval outright. If you want to deviate from that and still meet the intent of what the original code was, then you have to show how you are accomplishing that. And the building code allows you to do that same thing. If you can show that you're putting more insulation here and the performance of it still works just as well, then you can gain approval. And so at least that's the way I see these two different tracks. Is that, do you think, an accurate assessment?
Well, I think I understand where you're coming from. I think there may be even a little more nuance than that.
Okay.
In terms of the needed housing track, the clear and objective standards, yes, one piece of that is it should be clear to an applicant that if I meet A, B, C, and D, I get an approval. But also the pieces that I need to meet have to be clear and objective. So, for example, we talk about our 20% slope, or they tend to be very numerical. They tend to be easily measurable, so that the applicant can look at not only checking each of those boxes, but how to check each of those boxes and understand how that works. On the discretionary track, you still have to meet A, B, C, and D, but you may have more flexibility in showing how you've met it. So with a standard like compatibility, an applicant may be able to kind of bring in more information than just looking at a percentage of slope. I mean, those standards don't really align, but and show that overall, because of all of these 4 or 5 things, we've met this compatibility criterion. So
I put myself in the queue. I think that this was just kind of an update from council on the differences between needed housing or clear and objective and discretionary, and I think that we've dealt with that in the last 2 weeks. We've got an appeal that we just got done. That was a discretionary track one, and it had a lot of things where, on an appeal issue, we had to look at and decide what was the intent. And then now we've got one that we'll be looking at and taking a public hearing on tomorrow night that is on the other track that's needed housing, and will be, it's a little bit more black and white, at least in my opinion, from what I've looked through. So this was a good refresher, and since we've got both appeals in front of us within the last 2 weeks, I think it's very easy to see for me. Commissioner Jaworski, and then Commissioner Taylor.
Yeah, at the end of the IRS under next steps, you sort of say, you held meetings on June 11th and 12th to gather or identify key issues with the existing approval criteria.
That's our next item. That's our next agenda item. We haven't gotten into the agenda item C yet.
So just to be clear, I maybe should have clarified this at the beginning.
This is just the legal.
Oh, I'm sorry, I
Yeah.
thought we were doing the
They kind of
overlap.
public
Yeah.
improvement update.
They
I'm
kind of
sorry.
blend together, but yeah, that's our next one.
Janessa will be right up to talk to you about this.
Yes.
Oh, okay, I see.
Okay. Yes.
Man, I just,
The agenda.
just Commissioner Jaworski, going back to what you said about your view of Senate Bill 1051 and the language in there, I just wanted to kind of go just a quick level deeper on that one, because I think you're not the only one out there with that perception. I'm just wondering, is there anything specific about the language of that bill that makes you feel that way? And also, I was just going to check in with you, Lauren, since you've studied the language of Senate Bill 1051, what is it about it that seems clear that it applies to all housing? Because if there's more information about that, I'd just like to get it out there for folks. I don't mean to put you on the spot, but
So this portion that I was talking about, I'm not finding my copy of
It was
Senate
that slide. You have the slide up there where the definition.
Yeah, so Senate Bill 51 has now been incorporated. It's become effective, and it's been incorporated into ORS 197, 303 and 307. 307 talks about the clear and objective standards specifically, and it says, let's see, a local government may adopt and apply only clear and objective standards, conditions, and procedures regulating the development of housing. including needed housing, and then goes on to say what those would look like. That straight reference to housing is new, and that came from Senate Bill 1051. I understood Commissioner Jaworski's question a little bit differently.
I wasn't raising an issue on clear and objective. If
Yeah.
they say both are clear and objective, all well and good. I was raising a definition on the full scope and definition of all housing is needed housing, when I feel the second lines and third lines there give an opportunity for the city to define what they want to have as needed housing based on what I saw as the urban growth study, which showed where the gaps are, those gaps in rental and those gaps in housing cost, and it even gets into it, and it says price ranges and rent levels. That should be what's defined as needed housing, period. Everyone else goes the clear and objective discretionary route.
So,
It's,
yeah.
I'll be bringing it up other times with other people, so it won't go away. Just
I mean, I would just refer us back to the statutory definition of needed housing, which now includes the language from Senate Bill 1051. And it defines needed housing as all housing on land zoned for residential use or mixed residential and commercial use that is determined to meet the need shown for housing within an urban growth boundary at price ranges and rent levels that are affordable to households within the county with a variety of incomes. I think that determined to meet the need shown for housing within an urban growth boundary is the part that we have done through our housing needs analysis, and that would be done again in terms of another urban growth boundary expansion.
Yeah, I don't want to get into, I just view it as a policy that someone has said, let's have all needed housing, and no one has really taken a look and said, let's define it much more sharper and clearer, which would give neighborhoods more of an input through the discretionary, clear and objective route. I think, and I'll get it later, but I also understand some other municipalities have redefined that to have needed housing much more specific.
I don't know, that may well be true.
Okay, thank you.
All right, thanks.
Okay. All right, now we'll move, oh, I'm sorry.
Well, I was just going to tag on to that because I think Commissioner Jaworski's got a good point, at least from the way I read the ORS as well. You could read that to be, you remember that chart that we had where we had the different income levels, we had surpluses in some areas and deficits in others. And I could see this being applied to those areas where we have a deficit as needed housing because we need housing in those areas. And so I could see it being interpreted that way.
Would that require us to update our housing needs analysis that we did as part of Envision Eugene and the urban growth boundary?
I mean, we have a definition of needed housing right now. It's-
Well, and right or wrong, or whether we go that way or not, I can see getting there through the ORS.
as part of a future process.
Or
Policy
or being
decision, city
a
council.
policy decision, or even being challenged. So, that's just the
That's
way I see it.
your
too.
interpretation.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's an interesting one to consider, which I knew we weren't necessarily here today to kind of look at the detail of that, but it's an interesting one to consider that I thought about too, because if you look at, for instance, that future urban reserves, if it's all in an area that we've said we have surplus, and, you know, it's not going to be 100%, but let's say all the applications came in that, then our needed housing really hasn't been addressed. So looking at really what's the objective and intent around what the statute, what the bill was intended to do, but I know there's not huge clarification in that.
And I will say that, I mean, as you all know, land use planning is a complex web, and you know, starting from kind of what lands belong in the city, what lands do we need, what types of development do we need, all the way to a specific development application in which approval criteria and standards should be applied in the case of a specific development application, and you deal with all of those pieces, and needed housing is one of those things that kind of touches on a bunch of different land use planning issues. In terms of the code update, and Janessa will be able to speak to this in more detail, but my understanding is that the city is proposing to look at approval criteria and standards for specific development applications. There may be options in the future for consideration of what belongs on our housing needs analysis, but
Yeah.
that's not within the scope
Yeah.
of the code update project.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Okay.
Yeah, it's complicated.
Thank you for the update. We'll now be moving on to item number C, action, approval of the public involvement plan on the clear and objective updates. And Janessa will be presenting on this.
Yeah, we need a discussion.
Good afternoon. To those of the public that may not know me, I'm Janessa Dragovich. I'm a senior planner with the Planning Division, and I'm project manager for the Clear and Objective Housing Approval Criteria Update. So I'm here today to request approval of the Clear and Objective Draft Public Involvement Plan. The plan was first presented to you on May 8th, along with the project charter and a presentation giving you a project overview. We then presented the draft charter and public involvement plan to the City Council on May 30th. Sorry, we got bumped. On May 30th. And as mentioned in your AIS, under the Planning Commission and City Council input section, some of the commissioners had some concerns about the ambitiousness of the timeline. Some did not. Council was given that information, and after the staff presentation to City Council, as noted in the AIS, no concerns were raised by council that required amending the public involvement plan. And they did not adjust the project timelines. At both meetings, we communicated that we would be returning to the Planning Commission for approval of the public involvement plan later in June, and that's where we are today. So since those meetings, we've moved forward with phase one. This includes hiring the consultant who's doing our external code audit. And as part of the code audit, we conducted focus group sessions on June 11th and June 12th. And in all, about 12 neighborhood representatives attended, about 6 people from the building or the development community attended, and another 6 from housing advocates, affordable housing providers, and AARP attended another session. So out of the 56 invites we sent out, we got about 24 people actually able to attend, so about a 43% turnout, which is pretty good. In addition, we held one focus group with the internal technical review staff who work through the code every day. And the focus groups aren't the only way to provide input. I've met individually with a few people who were not able to attend. So the purpose of the focus group sessions was to identify the higher level kind of buckets for key issues. We're looking for input on what people think is working and what about the process we want to keep, what things need to be fixed, or what things are missing and maybe need to be addressed. So the topics that we were looking for could be tree preservation. We're not trying to get into solutions at this point. We're trying to identify just kind of the general areas of concerns that we want to address in phase 2. And at that point, we'll get into the meatier substance. There's still time to provide input. I've asked for a deadline of July 2nd just because of the timeline and needing to compile a key issues summary report. The code audit is due around just after that, and so that would give us time. As the commission is aware, staff's received several comments about the process and timeline for the project, and we understand concerns about the timeline. I'm feeling the pressure myself. But the project timeline is what's been given to me, and that's what I'm working within. It is ambitious, and the project, as outlined in the public involvement plan and the project charter, is designed to fit that timeline. As laid out in the public involvement plan, we're consulting and involving project stakeholders. We have received requests to provide more educational tools to help people better engage and work on, we're working on a fact sheet, a spreadsheet that was suggested that's a great idea to compare both, for each individual land use application type, kind of what standards are the clear and objective route addressing versus the discretionary track at this point. So within each of those 5 application types, you can see what the 2 tracks offer as different what the differences are, as well as an overall spreadsheet that will show you, comparisons between what does a subdivision look at versus a planned unit development, for example. So we're close to having some of those tools ready, and those will be put on our project website that has recently been put up, that compiles a lot of information that was already available, but it's putting it in one place and giving a location to keep project updates timely and thorough. So we're also considering, another suggestion was to hold kind of a similar to our Planning 101 presentations, but more of a specific, like Housing Land Use 101 presentation to also help people understand the processes better before we go into the working group sessions, where we'll really need to get a little bit more into the technical aspects. So again, at this point in the process, we've been consulting with stakeholders on the broader issue areas, and phase 2 will be more involved in looking at solutions. So those are kind of the comments I have, and I'm ready to answer questions and hope that we can approve the public involvement plan today.
Okay, I think we'll just kind of go around the thing. I'm going to start with a couple of statements. One is that I was able to attend the city council work session that she went to, and then again, I refreshed myself by watching it again last night. As far as the public involvement plan and direction from council, they were clear that they had no problems with the public involvement plan. They kind of, I think only three or four people spoke to at the work session. Councilor Pryor said, hey, this looks great. The other thing and then they kind of started asking questions that were phase 2 questions, basically, and giving input on phase 2. So as far as approving the public improvement plan and getting direction from council, I think that I'm okay with where we're at. The other thing is, I still have concerns about the timeline. I think that this is an ambitious timeline, but as Janessa said, council didn't waver from that. They said that they've got a year to get this thing done. Going to the public testimony that we heard, the fact of River Road and the great public outreach that they had. How long has River Road been doing this? 7 or 8 years. It wasn't said get River Road done in one year. And so, with that being said, I think a little bit of an accelerated timeline is necessary to get what's been directed by council. So, is this the best process? In my mind, I don't think it. I mean, I think that I'm okay with the public involvement plan. Is this the best process for doing this? I don't believe it is, because in my mind it's a very accelerated timeline, and that's really putting binders on us. So I just wanted that to be put out there. What we are looking for here is not getting into all of phase 2 and what is involved in phase 2. It's the public involvement plan and approving that. So with that, I will pass it to Commissioner Taylor.
So, sorry, I have a cold also. I'm going to echo what Commissioner Borowski said. I don't need to totally repeat the points, but we received a lot of public comment. I was one of the commissioners that was concerned about the timeline. I want success, and I'm not sure the timeline really allows for success. So I guess I think it would be helpful for the public that are listening. Do you know why the city council is driving? Is there a deadline because of the state mandates? Is there something driving this outside of our city, the pace?
I'm going to go to the people who were here. And
Yeah, I can speak to that, and Alyssa, jump in if you have other thoughts. But so back in, I think it was July of 2015, when council was wrestling with this whole idea of whether or not to go with a 2009 population forecast or 2015 population forecast for our study of the urban growth boundary expansion. There was conversation at that time, there was concern that the land that's in our inventory right now, inside the urban growth boundary, was some of the lands that haven't been developed for a long, long time are kind of sitting out there partly because they're hard to develop. And I think the feeling was that from the testimony that council heard, that, if we're going to go with the 2009 population forecast, which actually shows a smaller population looking out into the future than the newer forecast did, if you're going to do that, you should at least do something to make sure that the lands that are in our inventory for that 20-year period that can actually feasibly be developed somehow. And so I think council's response to that was okay as part of our direction to you staff in moving forward with this, with the UGB adoption, that we want you to come back within 12 months of completing that adoption and update the needed housing code standards to see if there's major barriers in there that are going to be a problem, and also to go out and talk to the community about what those changes might look like. And that 1-year deadline was established as part of that. And I think part of the urgency, and I'm just kind of speculating here again, there's nothing in state law or no other outside forces that are forcing that deadline. It was a desire from council to be responsive to folks in the community who had concerns.
Okay, that's good. I mean, I know as a body, Planning Commission has concerns with that too. We've expressed that in prior process.
Yeah.
So, and it sounds like based on your summary as well as your summary that City Council really, I mean, this is the direction that they're giving us. And like you said, you're working with that timeline. So what I did see, considering that timeline and considering the feedback we're getting from the public, is that what I didn't see here, which you articulated, is then how do we address a population, specifically, neighbors, for instance, how do we bring them up to speed? So hopefully City Council, hopefully there's resources for you and staff to support a condensed, shortened timeline. But I think the education, and you pointed it, because that's what I was realizing, that seems like it's missing. If we're going to do this, then let's figure out how do we do it to accommodate some of these concerns, which is education outreach, the 101 components. Now, it's going to put a lot of personal demand on neighbors to actually show up, but at least there's options for people to learn about it so that they can participate in a way that they feel, hopefully that they feel that they can be influential or thoughtful. So I guess that would be my observation. So, yeah, and it sounds like you've thought about it.
Agree. I mean, certainly in the public involvement plan, I didn't have like the 101, that's a recent thing, the spreadsheet's a recent thing. So I'm trying to be really responsive to hearing these concerns about, needing a higher level of kind of education to participate. It's, that's not falling on deaf ears. I do hear that, and I really want to provide that within the constraints that I'm in.
Right.
And so I'm working very hard to try to accommodate that.
And it sounds like you've got, I mean, it's nice that a lot of the testimony actually it appreciates that and recognizes or at least understands that you're listening and responsive. Compliments.
Yeah, and if I may, excuse me, I think that's great, and there's a lot of great suggestions for tools that'll help people. Ultimately, this is a technical exercise, right? And it's going to be because we're working on the code. We have a lot of policies that are in place. So, for example, the River Road Santa Clara project, I think primarily is policies like where are we going? What is the direction? What do we value as community members? So what we're doing here is working on a citywide project and really working within that policy framework that we've been given as a community. And sure, there are going to be some folks who are willing to delve in and learn the nuances of the technical aspect of the code, because ultimately that's where the rubber meets the road. I think what's also important is that as many folks possible as possible, engage as early as possible, and just sharing the value sets. What is important to people? What are they concerned about happening in the context of a development application? And on the other side, as a property owner or someone who's doing a project, what are they concerned about as they go into an application process? And this is kind of the spectrum of issues that we're trying to look at, that we can use as a framework for saying, okay, here's an issue, what are some solutions that might actually work for both of these? And that's kind of the next phase. So really, it's pretty high level. And we'll try to give people a variety of ways to engage, whether you want to engage at what's important to you or whether you want to engage at what does this piece of code say and how does that impact me?
So one last piece. So Janessa, it sounds like because you've been a great conduit for communication, is I guess what I would like, because of the short timeline, targeting the population that the neighbors that are not the particular neighbors, but maybe go to the neighborhood leader council, get a true understanding. What are the issues, where are the missing pieces, and brainstorm how to solve it within the timeline. Because like you said, if council's saying this is the timeline, I mean, I don't feel like I can necessarily say, well, we're going to ignore the timeline. Okay, well, they've been giving us direction, this is the timeline, but going to this group, because I really don't want to get to the decision, which is something we all want to avoid, that it unravels because there's so much public testimony that says that it wasn't adequate enough for them to be heard. So I don't know if you already have that understanding, but I'd want to kind of jump on it as soon as possible, get some kind of framework, throw some of these outreach meetings in there, because I do agree with you. It's primarily technical. At the same time, we have a public process so that people that do want to can include themselves in the process. But I don't know if you've done that, so that's kind of a question, yet maybe a suggestion.
Commissioner George?
Yeah, when is the deadline date for adoption? When I look at January 2019 and I look under Phase 4, I see a lot of things, public hearings on two fronts, which can also be extended a period of time. So it might not, that this thing not be adopted until February, March, if those meetings.
Oh, further.
Well, you
Yeah.
can't just have a public hearing and the next day say, okay.
Yeah.
I mean,
No, I'm saying it'll take a lot longer than that. January 2019 is when we're hoping to have council kickstart basically the formal adoption process. So initiating that. And so that formal adoption process could take 6 months.
Okay.
And that's those 2 public hearings and council, commission and council involvement.
The chair indicated I guess we're focusing on the plan in Phase 1 to limit our questions. In Phase 1, there's a summary of key issue report.
Mm-hmm.
Has that been prepared yet?
No. That's what we're working on now. That's the focus group input, the input we're still open to taking input.
When do you see that being published? Because you're already into concepts and evaluation.
Right, and we looked at given the timeline and the difficulty in planning out exact, we tried to kind of blur a little bit the Phase 1, Phase 2, Phase 3, because there is some uncertainty in there in how long to take. And like, for example, the focus group sessions and this concern, I had hoped to have the bulk of our input at that point. And so we're already 2 weeks from that, and I want to give another week to still have people giving me input. And so that's shifting us a little bit, and we're going to have to figure out how to make that up. The consultant's audit, the draft audit, should be to me July 6th. And so I'll be wrapping the code audit, the legal analysis from the city attorney's office, and some of my own input from these focus group sessions and
So sometime toward the end of the month? Mm-hmm. Okay. I attended one of the working sessions with the neighborhoods, and I think you did a superb job, because it was a difficult task. And one of the things you already highlighted, educational tools, fact sheets, whatever, I'm sure the neighbors, those that attended will welcome that, because it shows you are listening, which is really fantastic. My question is getting back to here about that same report, I don't even know if it's in a draft, but other than what you've mentioned, is there anything in that report that would impact the public involvement plan? Anything else that came up in that report that might impact that would be nice to be aware of now?
I don't believe so, because this report really is intended to be kind of a compilation of all of the issues. And at this point, we may need to point out what issues are kind of parking lot issues, so that we've talked about that before, like what issues are valid concerns, but clearly outside of the scope of this project, versus the ones that are, that are ones we're going to tackle through phase 2. So it's really creating that bigger list of items that we'll take to phase 2. That said, too, if something really critical comes out of, gets pointed out in phase 2, but wasn't addressed in phase 1, that's, we'll have to determine how to handle that, because if it needs to be addressed, it needs to be addressed.
Okay. Granted, the last public thing we just looked at with urban reserves was fairly extensive and identified all kinds of associations and whatever.
Mm-hmm.
You mentioned, again, meet with workers group and focus groups. Are they just going to be the same people? Is that going to be expanded? There's nothing saying like who are they? So I'm just saying that's lacking in here, but that's fine. But are they going to be the same groups or expanded?
I think that we've said that the interested parties and which is effectively the stakeholder group,
Okay.
can be, it's an evolving list. So if there's anybody who contacts me, I'm happy to put them on there and have them be involved. We're not turning away anybody at this point. We haven't had that issue, and we even with this list of 56, we got 24 people. So I'm not sure if I'm completely addressing your question, but I see the working group sessions potentially changing a little bit depending on the turnout we get. We realize we're going to be doing it during a time when it's going to be difficult for people in their schedules, and I think it will take multiple sessions, and so I think we will see some fluctuation in those people.
Okay. Well, whatever action we take here in adopting this package, I'm really pleased to hear your flexibility. You mentioned that to Commissioner Taylor, and you've indicated it to me. I would hope, just for the record, that what we adopted in the urban reserves public participation thing also has some flexibility, that's not etched in stone, and someone doesn't come back, oh, no, that isn't on the 6 pages we adopted. If there's some better way to do it or more public outreach to be achieved, you should have the flexibility to modify that and do it. And I'm hearing you say that, so I'm glad to hear that. Thank you.
Commissioner Randall.
You mentioned there were 2 approval criteria we previously relied on that can no longer be applied, and I think one of those is the 19 log rule.
Correct.
What was the other one? I'm trying to remember.
The other one is the transportation impact analysis, the requirement for, so that's a discretionary process, and so a hearings official determined that we couldn't kick to that process.
Okay.
Yeah.
So then also, you'd mentioned input by July 2nd. Is that just on the phase 1?
Yes,
part?
key
Just on the
issues.
still-
Key issues.
and again, I'm probably beating a dead horse here as far as the input, but just want to make sure that in phase 2, there's still opportunity for input.
Oh, absolutely, yeah.
Yeah. And then, I guess, it seems to me like we're really being reactive rather than proactive on this one. And so I think that's, and right or wrong, it sounds like, we've had challenges, the laws have changed, and so we're going in trying to fix it as best we can. And so it's really more of a reactive process than a proactive process. Is that a fairly accurate assessment?
I will say it's somewhat accurate, but however.
I'm not putting that right or wrong, I'm just the
Right.
reality.
However, I also want to point out that it's an interesting thing, because the public responses have sometimes been a little ahead of me, but like I'll be working on something in progress, and then something comes out that, and so it can give the appearance that I'm reacting or responding to something when I'm already trying to do it. But this is a monumental task that I'm trying to do on top of other duties. So I'm trying to be both responsive and proactive.
I wasn't putting that on you, I was putting that on the actual code change that we're looking at. We're really reacting to the lawsuits.
Oh, I
and
see what
the
you're saying.
challenges
Yes,
on
there
the
is that element,
code
yes.
changes.
Yeah.
more so than being proactive on trying to, kind of like, I saw Envision Eugene as being proactive. We were told we've got to do this, but then we decided to do this. And here I see us pretty much needing to try and fix some of the legal things that aren't working, and that's about as far as we're going to get in here. Is that?
I'll just throw it out there. I don't know. I think it's both. It depends on your perspective. There's nothing requiring us to do this effort. It is proactive on the part of council to say, all right, it sounds like there's some issues here. Let's go see what we can do.
Yeah, I think that, yeah, and I think that's appropriate. I mean, we've talked since I've been on the commission, and I'm sure going back further that Bill can tell us about, and going back further that John can tell us about, we have always felt that any time would be an appropriate time to go and have a look at the code and try and fix it. And it's such a monumental thing that staff time and it's just like, well, we can't get to it because we've got these appeals and we've got this and we've got this and we've got this. And I kind of feel that this directive from City Council was, okay, we understand, but this is one thing, you've got to do it. You can't put it off next time because of a council gave you another project, and council gave you another project, and council gave you another project, and it kept getting pushed down. And so they said, this is going to get done. And I applaud that, because I think that, just because we have to deal with this, how many of our appeals that we get, that we sit in, Tuesday nights listening to testimony and 2 or 3 meetings going through, that if clear and objectives were written a little bit better in certain areas, we may not get those appeals. And so I think it is appropriate, and I'm sorry that it took a slap on the wrist saying do this and do it within a year, but it's going to get done. At least may not get done the best way. That's the only problem that I have, is because I think that there's a lot when you get into these types of things. So I'm hoping for the best, and I also think that it is becoming of this commission to keep letting City Council know that this may not be the appropriate time frame. And whether that's sending a delegate to a public forum and making that point heard, because it's easy for them to go over and say, she says, Planning Commission thinks that this is a very, very tough timeline. But if we get, I think that City Council is going to start seeing it when they're getting, because these letters that we're getting are going to City Council as well, and they're going to start. It's going to start bubbling up. So if we get up there and say, we really don't know if this is the appropriate timeline, and you might want to get it more. I don't know if that's a position that we want to take, but that's something that I think we should think about as a council or as a commission going forward, to try and advocate to make this the best project going forward.
So Janessa, I'm just trying to apply it in other aspects of my life where there's really condensed schedules, which I'm definitely used to. Is there a way to have a check-in at each of the phases? Because what also concerns me is that you're saying you're a little late. So you've got the public feeling like they don't have enough time. There's some process that needs to maybe happen in terms of education in order for those that do want to get involved in this technical aspect to have that opportunity. But your timeline also concerns me, because you're the one helping to support and shepherd this forward. So is there a way to have check-ins where it feels like, hey, time out, and we go to council and have an extension of 2 weeks? Because if we're talking about extension of 2 weeks in order to accommodate something, is that possible, rather than just saying, okay, we're moving forward, and regardless of what the outcome is, we're going to stick to the schedule no matter what? And I'm not saying blow the schedule up. It's just being realistic about how do you create success within something that's condensed. Adding 2 weeks doesn't seem like or a month, doesn't seem like it's counter to their original intention. And I'm not sure it needs to happen right now, but I'm also thinking about your preservation in actually producing something that's meaningful at the end, because it's still a commitment. So you don't want to get to the end, and have it be, I'm not saying perfect, but having it intentionally be a little better.
Mr. Jaworski.
Yeah, I think this has already been addressed somewhere in talking either with you or someone, but I'm sure, did staff provide you, like with we get lots of appeals. With the appeals we've had where there were objections on whether it's clear and objective, so that we would have all those examples of things that have been appealed already, that maybe we could correct them?
Is that the legal analysis side?
Well, I don't know what the legal analysis was. If it included looking at all the appeals we've had based on, 19 foot is
I believe.
dispersion, but the point is the other issues, so that you have a list already, rather than just saying you're not going to come back clear and objective with TIA and just 19 lot only, so that there are a lot of others. Okay, that's good. And I would assume that from what I've heard, there is flexibility. I would assume, and could support that in whatever hat I'm wearing at the time, that come October, if you run into some issues, that it would be a good time to, if one wants to, look for an extension at that time, because based on where you basically are. Okay. One of the other things, and I don't know where to mention it, is I don't know what you're looking at, but under clear and objective, Lauren had said that PUDs were one of them. It might be nice under clear and objective to make sure what is a PUD, so that if we're getting them, that they actually have units on them, so that we can really make a determination that this is a planned unit development, not a planned development. So that would be interesting, and I think that would help a lot.
Okay. So at this point, is anybody ready to make a motion to approve the public involvement plan?
I would move so, with the understanding that it is as flexible as indicated, and it's not just etched in the pages we're adopting, but for the most part.
But if I may, if there's anything specific that y'all think would be good ideas for us to do moving forward, now is a great time. I mean, part of the reason we've put together these detailed public involvement plans is just, A, to communicate to everybody in the community, you, council, every resident who's interested, is to be clear about what we're going to do and how we're going to do it. So if there is anything specific, is a great time. And of course, we will stay flexible.
Mr. Randall?
Yep.
I don't know that I have exactly specifics, but I know I also face tight timelines on projects, and so I understand that. I think I was one of the ones that commented how, yes, this is a very ambitious timeline, but I think we can make it. But I think somehow incorporating into this the idea that if we can't make that timeline, really going to council. I know with my clients, if I'm not going to make a timeline, the sooner I communicate that with them, the better. And I know there's been concerns about having the bulk of this over the summer. And this is Eugene, and so that's difficult. And so, I think keeping that in mind, and somehow, whether it's in an October check-in or something, being able to say to council, hey, can we get another month or even 2 months, just to do that. And I don't know how to incorporate that, because we're not the ones that set the timeline. But I think it's good to try and target a timeline if you can still do it well. But if you're finding that you can't do it well, then another month. I don't want to be kicking it down the road 2 years.
Yeah.
But
Yeah.
but somehow just getting a little bit of extra time to do it better. And I don't know how to incorporate that into any kind of motion.
Okay. And that's fair. I'd also just like to kind of remind everybody that the purpose of public engagement is to daylight that full range of potential impacts right?
This is just that first part that we're approving.
Yeah, so we want to, it's not necessarily that we can or are even able to hear from everyone because everybody has different schedules and interests, right? But it's to get that full range of impacts and then to be able to communicate that to decision makers. That's really the main thing that we're after. And what is appropriate timing to be able to achieve that? That's the question. And tools.
I
Yeah.
have two things. One, a comment, but also I don't know if we're able to have a comment from the public. If you want now, I'm noticing there's a hand up. Or if we want to wait till the end.
Yeah, we'll wait
When we
till the
get comments, okay. So, I agree with that. So the only thing, what I like is, I think these are hard, the intention of the document is great. And I think there's also this potential lack of trust, that if you have a document that's placing intentionality of what a process is going to look like, that if there's something missing, or it becomes a really live document that some people view as static. So if there's some way to integrate, I mean, I'd like to see some of the integration of things that you've already started and that you're planning on to kind of address some of the concerns of just bringing people's education up. They might not even realize that it's a technical exercise, that really it's not about shifting the code entirely. But because of the lack of knowing is kind of my concern. But also somehow in the document, having it be clear in language that there is flexibility, this is only phase 2 or phase 1. I mean, whatever you can to have a level of transparency that builds that trust. Because I like that we're doing this, and I like that accountability, but once again, there's also a con to that potentially if people feel like their voice isn't included in somehow.
And just speaking to the motion of adopting it, I think that there's always, the Planning Commission is the Citizen Involvement Committee for Goal 1 of the statewide land use plan. So if it comes up and we see things that are not correct, we can always amend. We can come back and say, hey, we need to look at this again, or not that we would, but that's where we're at. So with that, all those in favor of approving the citizen involvement plan?
Did someone make a motion and second?
I thought Commissioner Randall made it. No?
I made it.
Oh, you made it, okay.
I don't know if we actually had an official.
We didn't have a second
Okay, I'm sorry. Is there a second to the motion
What was the motion, sorry?
to approve the,
to adopt the draft and the comments we made. It's with the understanding that there's some flexibility in it.
I think I interrupted with the timeline before we got to that second.
okay, so is there a second?
Second.
And,
That way we can discuss.
yeah, so the only, I would add pieces to it, just like I said, add pieces that you are proactively doing that has to do with education and outreach. And I would be really transparent that this is a compressed schedule, and this is how we're going to deal with that, to have inclusivity. And also, I think addressing forwardly, proactively, the NLC, and really making sure there's a clear understanding and brainstorming effectiveness within this compressed timeline. And try to move away from the fact that we've got this timeline and get to the real discussion. How do we get active, good discussion within this compressed timeline? And then the flexibility, clarity within the document that it assures people there's opportunity and flexibility.
Okay. All those in favor? 4. All right. At this point, I would just like to recognize that this may be Commissioner Jaworski's last regular Planning Commission meeting, and I would just like to say thank you to him for the input and perspective that he has brought to the commission over the time that I've served with him. I think he's been a great advocate for the neighborhoods, and specifically the neighborhood that he lives in, I've learned a lot about the struggles that the Harlow neighborhood has gone through, and since I live on the other side of the river, I rarely get over there. And so getting that perspective from different areas of the city has been very enlightening and very, and I think you've brought a lot to the table, and I may not always agree with you on particular issues, but it's always been very civil and very enlightening, and I have learned a lot from you. So I thank you very much for what you've brought to this commission.
Well, thank you. I don't think I could go out without another comment, but I'll just make one real quick. It has to do with urban reserves and something else, and I've said this for years here. We do a lot in this city in zoning and code. In all of our zones, we have all the maximum heights of building. We have the council saying we want to get into density, and we try to get into density, but you almost can't mandate density, but in fact, sometimes you can. And what I'm saying is I don't understand why we don't have minimum height standards. We see our transit corridors, which we want to see a density being developed on, having one-story buildings built. We see our downtown where we spend millions of dollars from not only general fund, but CDBG, and we see a square block with just a grocery store, and every city I've been in, grocery stores have big buildings on top of them. We're wasting the space we have. If we want density, we should have minimum heights in certain areas for that. I think that's critical, and I don't know why we're doing it. Other than that, I do want to say that being on the commission has been a real learning experience for me, and I really appreciate that experience. I've had a chance to work with staff and fellow commissioners that I feel are very passionate, they're very committed, and they have great integrity, which is something a commission like this needs. And I'm going to be going away with mixed feelings, but I think with the group that's here and from those that I've seen that are coming on board, it'll continue to move in the right direction. And thank you for allowing me to be part of this for the last, I don't know how many years. Thank you.
I just want to jump in and thank John for his service as well. John, I really appreciate your input. And as Commissioner Borowski said, we may not always agree, but you said it well. I think what this commission has is a lot of integrity. And I think of all of the commissioners, whether we agree on things or not, there's that level of integrity and respect for differing opinions that I think is good. I think that's something lacking in our national culture. And I think it's good to see that here. So thank you, John.
You're welcome.
Thank you.
Take care, get better.
Yeah. You two go enjoy yourself,
Yeah.
all that extra
So-
time.
I think we have,
John Belcher.
do we have something? I think
John,
we
did
might
you
have
want
a bit
to
of
say
a
something real
celebration.
quick? John Belcher.
I wanted to first of all
Yeah.
thank Janessa for her willingness to provide that education that's necessary. But the point I need to make is that education will arrive after phase one when you're asking for the input that the education will provide. That's a problem.
Okay, we do
Minimize the
have two
flexibility.
other things on here. Items from staff.
Well, the first item from staff is just to say on behalf of all of us, thank you, John. It's been a huge pleasure to work with you. You've been,
I
you
find that hard to believe. But
no, I mean, look, I mean, it's, these things that we work on are not easy, and you have volunteered hundreds and hundreds, thousands maybe, of hours to do this work. And I mean, whether we agree or whether it's easy doesn't make any difference. Just the fact that you do that, I think, makes a world of difference. And I just want to say thank you.
thank you.
And, you know, I think you've been reliable, very consistent, and you've always asked for clarity, right? You've always wanted to take this complex work and make it more simple so that people can understand it. And we've taken that to heart, and we've got a long way to go with that, but I just appreciate that perspective. And Envision Eugene has your stamp on it too, right? So it's a big deal. It's something to be proud of. So thank you. I think we have something too. Do we have a little something for
We
you?
do. Something's in the fridge and something's in my hand. Here's your certificate. You open that up.
Certificate. Wow.
Well, yeah.
Thank you very much. Oh, a picture. Wow.
Very nice.
I know we promised not to throw a
These were
party.
taken.
But
Geez, this will be good to have. That's great.
a little memento since we could, ambush you at the end of the last meeting with a couple of goodies instead of having a
I
party.
just had one question,
Yeah.
getting away from the celebration, on items from staff or items from commission.
Yes.
So I was looking, initially, there was supposed to be a public hearing on a couple of the items that we had public hearings on, and I was supposed to go and testify. Those got moved to July, is that right? Wasn't it supposed to be tonight?
No, those have always been
Always
July
in July?
16th. Those are the two code amendments,
16th,
correct?
okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
so those are being held July 16th, 7:30. That's the code amendments related to separation between retail medical marijuana and then the Skinner Butte height limitation and the uncodified ordinance for the sign.
Okay.
Yeah, thank you.
Yes.
And I do have a couple of staff items too, if you want me
Yeah.
to jump in.
Yep.
New planning commissioners were appointed by council last week, as many of you know. I think we have two of them here with us. Let's see.
Plus, Kristen was reappointed.
Where did this stuff go?
Yes, yes, also here.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you. Okay, let's see. So we have Lisa Fragola.
Hi.
And friendly area neighbor. And we also have Tiffany Edwards, thank you, Chamber of, and let's see, you are in the River Road Santa Clara, or the
For
Santa-
now.
Yes.
River Road Community Organization.
Well, I mean, River
right?
Road Santa Clara for another week, but I'm still in North Eugene, so.
Okay, fantastic.
Yeah.
And I just want to say,
What neighborhood will you
Yeah.
end up being in? Just curious.
Yeah.
Gillum area?
Gillum.
North Gillum.
North Gillum.
That's on northeast.
so thank you for being here today. We'll do maybe a more formal welcome and introduction when we have more time, but I just wanted to let folks know that they've been appointed. And the third person is Chris Ramey, I'll get to you in a second, who is a former planner for the University of Oregon, Fairmount resident. And I think he's out of town until June 30th or something like that. And finally, Kristen Taylor was reappointed. I know I can officially say congratulations on that, and congratulations to all of you. That's super exciting. It's really unusual that we have 3 new planning commissioners. I don't think this has ever happened in the 10 years that I've been in planning. I don't know if anybody else can remember that. It's so there's a lot of change, and we also have kind of a bridge situation going with the appeal for Verdict, thank you. And so we're going to have a public hearing before the new commissioners are on board, and then we're going to have deliberations after they're on board. And it creates a little bit of a challenging situation. So what we've asked them to do is just to check in and watch the videos or be here for the public hearing, and then we're going to do the best we can to, not here, thank you, in Harris Hall. We're going to do the best that we can. I'm kind of rushing through this a little bit to get everybody up to speed, at least on some of the basics before the deliberations happen. So we've kind of got our work cut out for us a little bit here.
And as soon as we know if Commissioner Baker can be here tomorrow night.
Yeah,
it'd be
for
nice to
John.
let know.
That's right.
I do
I
believe
don't know
he's
if we've
flying
heard.
in tomorrow, which was kind of the,
So it's a text, yeah.
yeah.
What
Yeah.
time does he get in?
I don't even know the details, so. The hearing, I do know the hearing is tomorrow, 6 PM, Harris Hall.
And because of
do
the legal implications, if we could let you off the hook, or if we know that it's all good, then we will.
I can meet him at the plane and drive him in.
There you go.
Or don't start your or just don't start your dinner plans until
Yeah.
6:15.
Yeah, otherwise the quorum's pretty thin these days, so I appreciate that. And let's see, I think I'll leave it at that. There's some other things to update. There's a few things coming to council coming up, but we can talk about that later.
Okay.
I have two really quick things. One, if you would give me your binders. So Chelsea, we'd sent out an email. Chelsea Hartman is redoing the binders for you and for the incoming planning commissioners. So you still have time to drop it off. It's okay. And then you have deliberation scheduled for the 3rd of July at 5:30 here. We will be sending out a poll to you and our new planning commissioners about getting a second date. so that there's, adequate time for that appeal. And it will have to be that week as well. We will not plan it for the 4th of July, but, yeah, but it will be sometime that week.
All right, with that, we're adjourned.
Thank you.
Cupcake time.
Chance to give me-
Okay, we're done.